Happy Monday, everyone. This is Martha with Nature Niche, and this week I wanted to do another invasive species post to help you with your invasive species management efforts this growing season. I'm going to talk about Hoary Alyssum. Berteroa incana is the Latin name, and it is in the mustard family. It's mostly an annual, but sometimes a biennial to short-lived perennial species. And it's an invasive forb that isn't as well known as some of the other invasive species like Phragmites and garlic mustard, Japanese knotweed, spotted knapweed. But one to keep in mind, especially if you're managing dry sites. It does really well in those dry habitats. It was introduced from Europe in contaminated clover and alfalfa seeds, so its seeds were mixed in. It was first collected in Michigan in the early 1900s, and it's since spread throughout the lower peninsula and upper peninsula of Michigan, along our roadsides, our railroad and utility rights of way, in sandy fields, along sandy shores and banks, and invading our savannas, our prairies, and other dry disturbed ground. So for example, here in my dry sand prairie behind the store, this is probably old sand left over from the construction of US 10. And it's just very highly disturbed, and I had an awful lot of it in the seed bank. So it is an invasive species I'm managing in my own dry sand prairie demonstration. The species is introduced and it's problematic across the United States, except for the lowest tier of states. And it's across Canada, even in Alaska. It's not in a lot of my standard invasive species textbooks, but it can be found as on the noxious weed list of many states. And it is a restricted noxious weed in Michigan as designated by the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, MDARD. So this species spreads long distance through contaminated forage and lawn seed mixes and in contaminated hay, as well as on contaminated equipment in the wheels and cutting parts and ground touching parts of mowers and vehicles, other machinery, and in the weed seed bank of translocated soils and gravel. Most seeds of this plant fall near the parent plant, but the wing seed may also disperse with wind and water. As far as environmental impacts go, the one most commonly described is that it is a forage hay issue. It decreases the forage value because the woody stems of older plants, so these do get pretty stiff and woody, those are low in protein and digestible carbohydrates. And it's well documented that this plant is toxic to horses. So when it's in the hay or out in the pastures, in hay fields amounts over 30%. Hoary Alyssum have been documented as toxic to horses. It causes sore feet and lameness, so laminitis and founder, in some cases diarrhea, limb swelling, even death when hay contains 30 to 70% Hoary Alyssum. And when it's mixed in with alfalfa hay, it's known to remain toxic for up to 9 months. So it is a serious toxic plant for horses. So if you have horses in your landscape, definitely want to learn this plant. As far as ruminants go, so for cattle, sheep, goats, llamas, there are no known adverse reactions. So let's talk about identification so you feel comfortable finding and eradicating this plant in your landscapes. So this plant gets 1 to 3 feet tall. It is very densely pubescent, and so that overall gives the plant a gray-green color or cast. The Leaves are alternate, so alternating along the stem, narrow, about a little over an inch long, sometimes up to 3 inches long, and they have an entire margin, so there's no teeth along those leaves. The stems are also hairy, densely hairy, and kind of look gray from a distance, with many branches up towards the top of the plant, or sometimes with many stems coming from the base of the plant. And young plants will also have a basal rosette of leaves that wither by the time the plants are blooming. So you can kind of see all this dead, dry material at the base of the plant. That was the basal rosette of leaves. The flowers are white in rounded clusters about 1 inch to 2 inches across. And if you look at the individual flowers, try to tease one out here. There are 4 petals, with each petal being very deeply cut or cleft, so that it looks like there are actually 8 petals, but really 4. So very typical of things in the Brassicaceae or mustard family. And the stems elongate during flowering, with fruit production beneath the newest flowers. So the plant flowers from the base towards the tip, and those branches elongate. And this plant blooms June through August. So here in July, we're kind of in the middle of the bloom period. Fruit is a round, flat, hairy pod. Again, typical of the mustard family. It only gets about 1/4 inch long, and there's a stub at the tip. That's the remnants of the style of the flower. And overall, these plants have a very deep tap root. So when you pull them up, you want to make sure you're getting that root crown and these deep tap roots. As far as control goes, this species is pretty easy to hand pull or dig up, especially after a rain and dry soil conditions. The top of the plant tends to break off at the root crown, and then the plant can resprout. So I definitely recommend, as your first line of defense, try hand pulling or digging it up, especially since it's an annual and the plant's going to die at the end of the season. Just pull it out, try to get all of the plant parts, all of the seed, and I would bag it and then put it in the landfill. And you can label the bag, invasive plants, and your landfill should take it. And that way you're not spreading it. If you were to place it in a compost pile, often our home compost piles don't get hot enough to kill the seed, and you don't want to use the compost and inadvertently spread this plant to additional places. So I definitely recommend hand pulling and bagging. Mowing is another option that's usually a good technique for annual plants. In this particular case, the species is pretty notorious for regenerating and then flowering at a lower level. So just know, if you're going to use mowing, do that before seed set, and know that you're going to have to come back and mow at an even lower elevation the next time to try to keep the plant from producing seed. Or perhaps you come through and then you hand pull on that second round. But both with mowing and hand pulling, it's going to take repeated effort over multiple seasons as that weed seed bank keeps putting up new plant material. And you want to make sure that you're starting with a clean mower and that you're cleaning your mower after you're done before moving it to another site again, so you're not inadvertently spreading the seed of this plant. Chemical control with herbicide is sort of a last resort for annual invasive species. It is something you can use to treat those basal rosettes in the spring before the plant bolts and starts flowering. MISIN, the Midwest Invasive Species Information Network, recommends a non-selective herbicide with low residence time in the environment, glyphosate, a glyphosate-based herbicide like Roundup. Again, when you're using herbicides, always read the label. Make sure you're following the label for your own protection, the personal protective equipment, and that you're applying on non-windy days. Hitting the plants before they flower is really important to minimize adverse impacts on pollinators. And just make sure you're following that label really closely. So in larger areas, that may be the tool you have to reach for, but in most cases for this species, hand pulling smaller infestations is the best way to go. Tilling and the use of prescribed fire are less helpful for this species. Tilling may break up the taproot, that root crown, but you're also bringing up weed seed at the same time, and you're degrading soil structure. So kind of the cons associated with that particular method probably outweigh the pros for this species. And prescribed fire, while it may burn up the plant, you might kill the seed, you're bearing the ground, reducing native plant competition or other plants that might shade or outcompete this invasive species. So you're kind of, it's a double-edged sword. You're kind of opening up the habitat for this plant to reestablish itself. And there are no known biological controls, so no insects or anything like that that can help control this particular invasive species. You can do cultural control though, in like doing hand pulling, and then what I did out here, seeding in good native, drought tolerant native plants to provide some plant height and cover and compete with this invasive species for nutrients and water and sunlight. So I hope this helps you recognize a very common dry site invasive species. And like I said, hand pulling's the best way to go, and I have a fair bit to do in my own prairie in the coming weeks. Take care. Have a good week.